Hello, welcome everyone. Can you listen to me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. From my side, everything looks perfectly okay, and I assume all the participants, they can see us and they can listen to us. Let me start this event. We are here for embedding entrepreneurship in engineering education from mindset to practice. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. I don't know how many countries and where are these participants are, but I welcome you all. My name is Asif Khan. I live in the Netherlands. I work at University of Applied Sciences at Saxon, the Netherlands. And I'm member of the SEFI. I will introduce that what is SEFI. And I welcome you all to this webinar titled Embedding Entrepreneurship in Engineering Education from Mindset to Practice. The event is hosted by SEFI, which is Society for Engineering, European Society for Engineering Education, and it is the largest network focused on engineering education in Europe. And under this society, there are multiple special interest groups. One of them is entrepreneurship in engineering education. And this special interest group on entrepreneurship in engineering education is now organizing this webinar, and this whole interest group is here to welcome you. Okay, thank you all for being here with us. The purpose of this webinar is we explore an important question. How can we better prepare engineering students not only to solve the problems, but also to identify opportunities, create value, and drive innovation? Entrepreneurship is no longer viewed as an optional skill. It is becoming central to engineering education. And our speaker today brings deep expertise and inspiring perspectives on this topic. Now let me introduce our speaker. The keynote speaker for today is Dr. Nikita Hari from the Department of Engineering Science at the University of Oxford. And it is my great honor to introduce her here at this special interest groups webinar. Dr. Hari is widely recognized for her work at the intersection of engineering, innovation, and education. She has contributed significantly to rethinking how we nurture the entrepreneurial mindset among future engineers. We are delighted to have her share her insights with us today. Let me just briefly mention 3 points, which is like structure of this session. So first, we will have a keynote presentation by Dr. Hari. Then we have a very short moderated discussion, and depending on the participation of participants, then we can decide how can we proceed to the third session, which is question and answer session, where you can share your questions and reflections. Depending on the participation, we can join this moderated discussion with this question answer session. But let's wait till then. With that, thank you once again for joining us. And it's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Nikita Hari to take this virtual floor. Dr. Hari, the screen is yours now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. I hope I am audible and the slides are visible to all of you. So, welcome again. Good
Yes.
morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whichever part of the world you are joining from. And thank you so very much for your interest, for being here virtually. I'm delighted to be sharing with you all, and hopefully, we can all rethink engineering education within the context of entrepreneurship. A big thanks to SEFI and the newly formed SIG team, particularly Dr. Asif Khan, for the kind introduction and the invitation. So, firstly, let me begin by setting the expectations for this talk. Like mentioned in the abstract, this will not be a toolkit or a Y2 session. Let's take this as an exploration, but not as a prescription. So I'm hoping you all can leave, including myself, with better questions, not a checklist. So before we talk about the significance and how to embed entrepreneurship, I suppose it's worth asking why this conversation feels so urgent now and why it probably keeps resurfacing across institutions and policies. So, entrepreneurship has become a strategic priority across majority of the institutions, and the need and possibly the pressure is coming from industry, policy, accreditation, rankings, and so on. So let's just begin by pausing, reflecting, and asking. So, if entrepreneurship is clearly on everyone's agenda, that means it does lead to a very uncomfortable question, isn't it? When we say we want entrepreneurial engineers, what do we actually mean in practice? I hope that the newly formed SIG will be the right and timely and a very good platform and forum to explore this in detail. And we begin one of those conversations today. So, when we ask this question, I want to emphasize on classrooms, not strategy documents. Meaning, on a normal teaching day, let's say on a Tuesday, you know, afternoon, you have your engineering lecture, and what is, and you want to very proactively integrate or include entrepreneurial elements in there. But what does an entrepreneurial student actually do differently in your class, and how are we delivering this? So this, let's again pause for thought. I'm not expecting answers. At this point, I would say that, as I go along, if you have insights and things that you are doing, please feel free to input that onto the chat. But specifically, if you think there are questions worth looking at and discussing, you can use the Q&A section so that it doesn't get lost in the chat. Now, dialing back, I want to share where this particular question on your screen comes from for me. Because my own understanding of entrepreneurship, if you look back at my experience in education, has been less shaped by theory and more by moving across different contexts. So before we dive any further deeper, let me first offer a quick disclaimer. This slide is not necessarily just about me. It's more to give you all a context for the perspective I'm speaking from. Because whenever we think about rethinking or reimagining engineering education, it is important for those in the listening end to understand where the speaker is coming from. So I'd say I've worked across what I would call the 6 Ps: pedagogy, practice, products, processes, policy, and people over the 2 decades of my career. So from the classrooms in India to co-founding AI at tech startups at Cambridge, integrating that into my research, from advising UK and Indian government bodies to working with nonprofits. So, from pedagogy to people and from policy to products, it's quite an intersectional and interdisciplinary space I have operated and are still operating in. As somebody now forging all these different elements into my role at the University of Oxford, Department of Engineering Science, spearheading the practical engineering education. Now, why does this matter? Because I've seen that entrepreneurship in doesn't happen in one silo, right? It happens and all the transformation that we are talking about in education, it happens at the seams across sectors, systems, and when perspectives collide. So, when I briefly trace my movement across higher education, industry, policy, ethic, and global initiatives, what I want to emphasize is not the credentials or the achievements, but the tension in the boundaries. And that's what I want to build on in the talk, because wherever I've worked, people have valued entrepreneurship. But then what's the issue? The issue is that they all meant very different things by the word entrepreneurship. So, across all these roles and across all the different organizations I have worked and are still working with, one pattern has kept repeating. We are preparing students for increasingly complex world, a volatile, uncertain, ambiguous landscape. Yet, our educational systems often lag behind that reality. So, with that context setting, I'm going to zoom out now and let's now enter from my world into the real world. Ideally, educators are supposed to be preparing students for the future, to be a good citizen. And I would say to enter what I would term as a complexity era, a world where problems don't come neatly labeled as electrical, mechanical, civil, or humanities. They're messy, they're interdependent, and often without precedent. I'm sure all of us in the room would agree to that. So, whether it's AI in healthcare, to climate resilient infrastructure, to ethical technology policy, these are not just engineering challenges. These are very systems challenges. So, on that note, let's now take a moment to reflect as educators. When do you think your teaching intentionally integrate uncertainty, interconnection, or ambiguity, risk taking into the day to day curriculum? More often than not, as much as we would all like to, we are still forced to operate in systems that expect clarity, linearity, and predefined outcomes, right? So, on that note, I want to ask, are our educational structures evolving at the same pace in which our technologies, with lightning speeds, they are expanding, evolving with the blink of an eye? So, with that, I want to now take us to what some might call provocative, but at the face of it, this very line of few words that you see on the screen, it stings, right? But it is true. Now, the tension, I'm sure, isn't new. In fact, it's been articulated very clearly, perhaps uncomfortably clearly, by others in engineering education and not just Grasso and Birkins. So, too many of our structures, timetables, assessments, accreditation processes are all optimized for an industrial model of education. But students are walking into a post industrial, AI powered, uncertainty rich world. So, this isn't just a curriculum update we are talking about or that we require. Again, I bring back the fact that it's a systems level rethink of how we define engineering education. Because if we want to prepare students for a world that is becoming, not the one that was, We need a different kind of learning ecosystem, one that integrates complexity, ethics, agility, and inclusion at its core. So, having said this, I would say I see this quote not as a criticism on educators, but as a mirror on the institutional inertia. This isn't necessarily about bad teaching, it's about misaligned systems. So, if we accept this mismatch, so the next question is, what kind of engineer are we actually trying to educate for the 21st century? And SEFI and everybody involved in this have been looking at it from many different angles. So, if we go back and look at the evidence based research out there, it would show that a 21st century engineer isn't just expected to be a technical problem solver. They are a systems thinker, a collaborator, a communicator, and an entrepreneur. So, they need to be able to move between disciplines, think ethically, build with empathy, and lead under uncertainty. Or at least they should know what this means in practice. So, in short, the future engineer is not expected to be just trained in tools, they are expected to be shaped to navigate, design, and transform systems. And to prepare engineers like that, we need education systems that reflect this complexity, equipped to instill survival skills in the AI augmented complex world ahead. So, through the visualization of the skills, I want to now point out how entrepreneurial thinking sits alongside ethics, systems thinking, communication, and all other relevant skills. And this is where we want to look at entrepreneurship here as a way of thinking and acting, not just venture creation. So, entrepreneurial thinking appears repeatedly in our institutional vision and documents, but recognizing it is one thing, embedding it into everyday teaching practice is, is completely different. It is quite another thing. So, now, if we ask ourselves, what is a common trap we fall into would be that we often stop at mindset and assume that practice will follow. Whereas there is a progression from mindset to behavior to practice. And in order for that to happen, embedding is a core concern. And if you look at it, one reason I think, and please challenge me on this, I feel from my own lived experiences and observation across the landscape of higher education, embedding feels difficult from the context of entrepreneurship because entrepreneurship as such is often misunderstood and is interpreted in different ways. And this is where possibly systems thinking could become a useful bridge. It's important to understand that entrepreneurship is not just business plans. It cannot just be an optional module. We have to think about what are the from a skills and attributes and capability perspective. We need to be able to use a systems thinking lens to help students see consequence, not just the end solution or results, but the process. And that's where entrepreneurial thinking becomes clearer. So once we start looking through this viewpoint, this perspective, this lens, an interesting question emerges that it's not necessarily about adding new content, but also about noticing what's already in there. And to think about, and if I would want to encourage internal scanning of curricula in your minds as you sit here, what would that look like? Where in your curricula do you think entrepreneurship is already there, but you haven't just named it or assessed it in that way? So let me make this more concrete. Not with models to replicate, let me emphasize, but with a few experiences that we can all think with. And like thinking about it or walking briefly, if you think about the curriculum, project based learning, assessment, and industry engagement, these are all different areas in which we might already be using or can use um, or embed entrepreneurship. So these are experiences to think with, not necessarily templates. Now, all these examples obviously show possibility, but they also reveal where things get genuinely difficult, isn't it? If you are on the ground delivering these things, you will relate to what I'm talking about. Now, especially it's critical when we try to think about scaling or sustaining initiatives of this sort. So now moving on to then thinking about the challenges, I want to draw your attention to scaling beyond champions, about staff confidence and capacity, and your institutional constraints that might be from accreditation, that might be from assessment, that might be internal or external. And I think this is where good intentions of embedding can quietly drift away. And this is where there is a subtle risk that will slowly begin to emerge, often very unintentionally, and what I would refer to as entrepreneurship washing. Now, what does that mean when we change the language but not the learning, right? And this obviously is relevant to all institutions. So let's try and unpack what that actually looks like in day to day educational practice. See, entrepreneurship is often mentioned in education, higher education, but not truly embedded into practice. And that's a conversation we are having today. Activities may be added, yet assessment methods and learning approaches would remain unchanged. Or in some cases, while students are exposed to startup language, they seldom experience real uncertainty or make genuine trade offs. And success is frequently measured, let's say, by appearances, events, and partnership instead of by shifts in student mindset or behavior. So, what I want to emphasize here is the factors of optics versus impact. And to emphasize, or for us to now think about and pause on the reality that visibility is not the same as capability. And at this point, I think it's again worth reflecting, not to judge, but to reflect very honestly on our own programs and to consider where the label entrepreneurship may be used without genuine entrepreneurial intent, activities, or outcomes. So, when we review program materials for superficial application of the term, and where we might engage with stakeholders to identify areas where actual entrepreneurial skills and mindsets are not being fostered, and alignment, there's no much alignment between aims and practice. So at this point, I want to invite self reflection. And let me be very clear that this is not some kind of blame shifting, it's more about self awareness and to always pause deliberately before we move on. And to emphasize again, I think emphasize is the theme of my talk today. I'm using that quite repeatedly because this is not a semantic issue, isn't it? There are real consequences when entrepreneurship becomes symbolic rather than, let's say, substantiative. So, overstating that entrepreneurial readiness fosters false confidence. Because why does it matter? But when you think about it from a student perspective, it leaves them unprepared for real world challenges. Now, this can also result in educator fatigue and cynicism when teaching methods seem ineffective. Furthermore, such practices obviously undermine genuinely embedded systems informed approaches that are essential for meaningful and sustainable entrepreneurship education. So, now looking at the consequences, And summarizing it, I would say false graduate confidence or student confidence, educator fatigue, and fragile innovation cultures. So that's what essentially this leads to. And washing doesn't just fail, it actively undermines trust within the educational system and the whole purpose of it. So, which brings me to another question, one I would encourage you to sit on and possibly something we can pick up as we move along. I'd like the slide to sit for a few seconds here and for you to read through and to think about these four different elements of challenges. We don't need to answer this now, but it is again worth holding on to. Because if we take these questions seriously, it would start to challenge some of our own assumptions about risk taking, productive failures, genuine assessment, and what each of our teaching and education systems value. And with that, I come back to and I then now want to raise this point about let's now dial back a bit and think about if entrepreneurship was removed from our programs, from our curricula, what core experiences would change for the students? And then to think about where do students truly face uncertainty in their learning and where is risk minimized? Thirdly, which activities are called entrepreneurial but not assessed? So these are the four different questions that you have seen in the last slide. Now, translating those reflection into insights, why would that matter? Because we are challenging assumptions here, right? So when we are trying to embed the entrepreneurship education, embedding often means subtracting something or stopping something. It could be content, it could be culture. So, what does authentic entrepreneurship in engineering actually looks like? I come back to where I started off. When it is genuinely labeled, genuinely embedded, rather than labeled. So, countering entrepreneurship washing would involve embedding entrepreneurial skills within engineering practice. And it's vital to align learning outcomes, activities, and assessments to ensure coherence. So, valuing student processes, the learning journey, judgment, ability to make trade offs, all these are just as important as celebrating outputs and successes. And this would necessarily lead to meaningful entrepreneurial skill and capability development. So now I want to shift from self critique to clarity, where I want to stress coherence within outcomes, activities, and assessment. So we must definitely, I believe, value judgments and trade offs and just not just the zeros and ones of outputs or polished outcomes. So, what stands out to me is that authenticity comes not from adding more. And authenticity, when I say that, it's within the context of entrepreneurship education, but necessarily from knitting things together with purpose. So, what does that mean? In very simple terms, I would say I want to stress purpose over compliance, that it needs to be all knitted together into the program, into the curricula, into the day to day delivery, not something to be bolted on. Entrepreneurship, as we see now, is very loud, but I think it needs to be coherent, even if it's silent. And even with this clarity, on a practice level, some fundamental questions still remain, right? And these don't have universal answers. And that, I believe, is the main issue with entrepreneurship education, because there are no universal answers, only contextual ones. Entrepreneurship in itself, whether it's the skills, the thinking, and attributes, even though fundamentally it has some elements which are very basic, it can still mean different things in different cultures and contexts. So, if we think about how much entrepreneurship is enough, who owns it in a program, and what are we willing to let go to make space for it within an already dense engineering curricula, these questions matter not just at the module level, but at the level of programs, at the level of cultures and institutional structures. And that's very important. So, considering how much entrepreneurship should be integrated into our own programs, into your program for optimal impact is very important. So, reflect on who truly owns that responsibility, whether it's the individuals or the organization as such. And finally, there is a need to discuss what existing practices or priorities may need to be let go or shifted or changed to create meaningful space for entrepreneurship. And this is where I want to reinforce that program level thinking and to stress shared ownership. I think what's happening now is, all of this sits with some enthusiastic individual or a certain tribe of people. I'm sure many of those are in the e-room today. But that cannot just be the case for it to be sustainable and scalable. And at this point, I go back where I started. And I hope that it is becoming clearer as we move along that we don't necessarily have definitive answers and need to. So as much as I'm interested in sharing my experience, I'm more interested in all of us learning from each other. And I do have a strong belief that we learn fastest when we surface and share experiences with our own tribe, be it the SEFI community or from elsewhere, and question together. So, on that note, um, to kick off, I would invite each one of you or those interested in the room to share one practice that's already happening and one unresolved question you might have in the chat. And I want to close with saying this, that embedding entrepreneurship is less about having the right answers, because that goes against the very essence of the word entrepreneurship, if you think about it, isn't it? And it's more about asking better questions together with your students. It is about productive failures, it is about the whole process. It is about the journey. And that is why entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial thinking is key, because that prepares students for real life. And real life, like I said, doesn't come in silos. It doesn't only have, electrical, mechanical, civil uh, backgrounds. It has to be heavily integrated into the psyche. So, on that note, I would really encourage you all to share your experience, your doubts, your curiosity, your disagreements, perhaps with some of the things that I've mentioned, or your ideas to the e room so that we can rethink and reimagine together. So, once again, thank you all for being here, for being the change maker that I believe higher education and specifically engineering education needs. And just to summarize what I have been talking to you until now is, to me, embedding entrepreneurship in engineering education would mean integrating entrepreneurial ways of thinking, designing, and acting into core engineering learning so that students regularly practice opportunity recognition, judgment under uncertainty, stakeholder awareness, and trade off analysis within their technical work, and not just in the context of a business venture. And so that hence the need why it shouldn't be just an add-on, elective, or an isolated activity. So to me, it involves aligning learning outcomes, teaching activities, and assessment so that entrepreneurial capability develops naturally, organically through everyday engineering practice in the classrooms. Obviously, it needs to be supported by systems thinking and real world constraints rather than being taught separately as just a business or startup content. So, thank you all once again for being here. So, the best way to connect with me would be on LinkedIn, but you also have my contact. So, it's 30 minutes, and I will now leave it open to the audience and happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nikita Hari. It was so nice, very enlightening, and the question that you posed for discussion, I really liked it. And let's give the opportunity to the participants what they think and what are their experiences. Let's share our knowledge. And I already see some questions popping up in the chat. Uh, should I start, Nikita? Should I start with this question? What kind of learning outcomes, skills, or competencies can be considered under the label entrepreneurship? This is from Samira, if I'm right. This is, yeah. And should I say something and you or Nikita, will you try to answer this?
Yeah, sure, sure. Please go on, Dr. Khan. Please feel free to, I've been talking for at a stretch, so maybe it's good to have some insights from others, and I'm happy to take the questions as we move along.
Okay, so let me share my understanding and opinion on this. What kind of learning outcomes, skills, and competencies can be considered under the label entrepreneurship? To my understanding and practices that I have been doing in some of the universities is under the constructive alignment and outcome-based education systems from Washington Accord and different European uh, accreditation bodies and education models, the most suitable one, which is not only we follow, but we also see different guidelines that are linking entrepreneurship to outcome, learning outcome. The most relevant to me is the creativity and innovation. So all those subjects that we have in engineering, my field is electrical engineering and applied computer science, or the computer engineering. We often, if we have the opportunity to offer these kind of courses and include this in the curricula, then we link it to the outcome of creativity and innovation. And we also link it on the second priority to the lifelong learning. Uh, yeah, this is my experience. And now any one of you can say something on this, but I would first ask Nikita Hari if she has a different opinion or something to add on this.
Firstly, thank you, Samira, for the question. I think it's a really good one, and thank you, Dr. Khan, because he's given um, an integrated approach to how that aligns with the accreditation and the professional institutional framework. And obviously, engineering being a heavily creative profession, but not necessarily defined and seen in that way. I think it's important to understand that creativity is one key element of entrepreneurial thinking. And for me, entrepreneurship is, I would define it or explain it as a capability to create value, right, under uncertainty by making informed technical and non-technical judgments under within real world constraints. And this capability is what I would then want to assess through learning outcomes, skills, and competencies. And if I look just from the framework of learning outcomes or competencies, I'd say identifying and framing problems, because we always talk about giving a problem and for students to solve, but it is important. And one of the main things that I have noticed across my um, time in higher education is the students are very bad when you do not give them a well defined problem. See, first of all, there is a need for them to be able to identify and be able to define a problem before they can solve it. So identifying and framing problems worth solving as well, right? Within the context of real world. And translate those ill-defined, uncertain needs into engineering requirements and recognizing opportunities um, within technical, societal, or industrial context is how I would define that competencies or learning outcomes. Just let's say also, tying this to the next question about giving a tangible example. And what would that look like? And what would that start off is with that opportunity and problem framing identification. And I believe that is very foundational. And secondly, decision making under uncertainty. Thirdly, systems and contextual thinking. Now, the big factor or key element of engineering and engineers are that there are no zeros and ones. There are no right answers. There are several universally relevant answers for each context, right? It depends upon the constraints. So entrepreneurship has to meet that engineering professionalism to be able to understand boundaries, interactions, unintended consequences, considering stakeholders, users, regulations, sustainability, ethics, and anticipating that second order effects of engineering decision. So that, I believe, is another, I would say, the third important thing would be that. And what would that look like in practice is how you integrate that within an awareness of supply chains, users, life cycle impacts, and how do you balance competing stakeholder needs. So, you can think about integrating some of these elements into the day-to-day projects you might have. And fourth, if I needed to add two more elements, I would say it is execution, initiative, and learning from failure. Very, very key, especially for the so called Gen Z, right? The fact that you have to take initiative, take ownership of open ended tasks, which necessarily are an important element of project based learning, and to test those assumptions, whether it's through prototyping or experimentation, and to learn constructively from failure, from iteration, from feedback. And obviously, I think what does that look like in practice is I think that can be very neatly embedded, and that's a hallmark of project based learning in many ways. Acting without waiting for full instructions, taking that initiative, and treating failure as a data, not as an emotional setback and a deficit, to be able to create that emotional intelligence as you move along. And lastly, I would say it's that value creation and communication, and to be able to articulate an engineering solution to different audiences. So, explaining why a solution matters and what context and how it works, and adapting that communication to different audience. And in on its own, I would want to now, in the context of this question, also emphasize that it's not just about writing some business plan. It's not about pitching without decision making authority. It's not just about attending a startup talk or a hackathon. All these are different elements which can help them develop these skills. So it's about moving away from creating a exposural or visible face of entrepreneurship just being this about learning business terminology detached from engineering practice. So thinking about those skills and attributes and how that aligns is, I think, for me, within the context of where I operate as well, how we need to integrate uh, entrepreneurship into engineering education. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but I hope I've connected that now to the second question as well.
Yeah, thanks, Nikita Hari. Um, yeah, for me, the last time I included this in one of my course that was embedded system that I was teaching previous semester. And uh, yeah, the students
Mhm.
were encouraged to apply these skills and related theories into a project so that they can use uh, the microcontrollers and develop something with this entrepreneurship encouragement, and they can do. And uh, they were some of those student groups were very successful in applying these concepts on environmental monitoring with developing small devices that can monitor and provide signals and the comfort level in an indoor environment. And they applied very relevant technologies and techniques related to entrepreneurship. Of course, we don't have a separate uh, module that teaches entrepreneurship to engineers, but we are allowed, and we are happy that we can encourage students in different engineering modules to take benefit out of these and to exercise some of these theories and concepts in limited resources that we have.
Yeah, I just want
Uh,
to quickly add to that because of the second question, because they've specifically asked on in a day-to-day basis. If, for example, I come from an electrical and electronics engineering background, and I, for example, had a assessment which was integrated with a lab, and it was about designing a smoke detector. And instead of giving specifications, I said, you have to design this for your room, right? Because they were all in hostels and we knew the specification of the room. But then they had to look at that specification, design it, and then there were elements. So it was about defining the problem. Then they need to think about designing it in such a way that they have to look at the existing solutions and to make it sustainable and also accessible and inclusive. People who are blind or deaf and so on and so forth. So basically, giving them a working, and also another way is to give them a working but flawed system, and for them to decide what to improve, for whom, and for what constraints. So there are different ways in which we can do it. And for example, picking or working with an industry, then I had different elements to it. And one of the elements was there was a huge industrial issue that has happened with a particular device they had, and it had to be recalled. And then they had to imagine that they were the CEO of the company. They had to go and figure out the technical issue of what went wrong, and so on and so forth, and then come around and talk about it or communicate that in a manner that we assess. Now, the assessment, I would say, is still a work in progress, right? Because unlike your equations and anything with zeros and ones, rewarding people for the journey, for the process, is is very much something that's still that requires a lot of time, effort, and I have to admit that it is much more time consuming, resource intensive, and very much depends. You have to get on board people who are entrepreneurial in nature to be able to understand the process. How in US setups they would always reward people who have started a startup and failed multiple times, rather than somebody who just had a small thing and they are successful. So it's also culturally and contextually different as well. So I just wanted to quickly point out that.
okay, I see some of the candidates have questioned, but I also see that there is a lengthy list of questions. So let's focus on the list. Uh, Otherwise, we will not be able to finish them on time. What are the differences between teaching engineers into entrepreneurs and cultivating entrepreneurial engineers? Yeah.
I think that's, I'm sorry, I don't want to get the name wrong. So Wenhyun, is it? But I think Dr. Kai, that's a really good question, and I think that's the difference, right? I was necessarily talking about teaching entrepreneurial skills for engineers in the context of the complex era that they are going to be living and working in. And that doesn't necessarily mean you will become entrepreneurial engineers, like you will be successful within a business venture, because that obviously comes with other elements like and other skills required. So I think that distinction has to be clear, that when we say we as educators are trying to integrate this into the curricula, we are not trying to produce business. What I wanted to make clear is that it's not trying to produce everybody in the classroom to become an Elon Musk or a Bill Gates. It's more about making students understand that operating within real world, being creative, being able to understand the design thinking and processes involved in engineering, and being able to deal with uncertainty, risk taking, and failures, and carve out a journey is extremely important in the context in which they will be operating. And that is where I think the difference has to be clear. There is a clear difference, at least as I see it, because when you're trying to create entrepreneurial engineers, you obviously they should have a much more understanding of different elements of business creation, venture capital, financing, and all the different elements that is required to be able to be successful and to be able to become an entrepreneur. I think developing entrepreneurial skills or some elements of entrepreneurial skills doesn't necessarily mean you will become a good entrepreneur. I think that has to be um, clarified, or I would like to take this opportunity to clarify that from my end. I think that there's a lot of questions
Thank you.
coming.
Yeah. The key is that we have an idea of what we consider entrepreneurship. The QAA has, yeah, if, Ruth Hoopman. So if you are referring QAA, it's the for the guidelines for the UK
Quality, yeah.
education. Yeah, I like that those guidelines. Uh, yeah, I would somehow agree to that. Yes,
Mhm.
but then move on to the next one. How much business and finance knowledge are needed to be embedded to achieve the entrepreneurial mindset in engineers?
I'll be, in the interest of time, I'll make this very quick. So this is again, yeah. So thank you for that question. And again, it aligns to, or it connects to what I was talking about before. If you really want to be a good entrepreneurial engineer, versus if you want to be a successful um, entrepreneur, the, the the level of business knowledge and finance knowledge you require will vary. For somebody who has a business knowledge, I think, regardless, everybody should have basics of finance and business being taught. But again, that's for another discussion. Now, as part of entrepreneurial skill development, it is important to have some basic foundational understanding. And this is where, that spectrum of integrating entrepreneurial skills versus becoming an entrepreneurial engineer. So where that spectrum would vary. And it is equally important to look at it from when we talk about technical engineer versus engineering scientist versus engineering educator versus a generalist engineer. All of these people have different levels of skill sets and different depth of content versus capability. So I would say it is the same logic I would apply to both these cases. It depends on, where is the spectrum, right? Are you teaching entrepreneurship education because that's you're trying to create entrepreneurial engineers, or are you doing this as an integrated element because that's very much part of engineering education and should be, because the world, needs people like that. I think I've kind of, to Jeff's point, I have answered the next question.
Yes. Yeah. And then I see some nice references. Yes, these are very nice references to the framework, uh, enterprise entrepreneurship. Yeah, this is the QAA guidelines for the education. This is a nice reference. Most learning outcomes are conventionally centered around knowledge attainment. How do you assess competency-based learning outcomes?
I think we have kind of touched upon it. And
Yeah,
I think this is
like
where,
the outcomes. Yeah,
you need to rely on evidence based assessment frameworks that different people are developing and to integrate that process based, productive failure based, or risk taking elements. When you integrate all this, right? How do you define creativity? How do you define productive failure? How do you define risk taking? How do you define problem framing within the context of engineering education assessment? And I think it's important that at this stage, as a practitioner, it's where the collaboration comes in key, and we work with people. And what I have tried and done in my own assessments is to then develop that into an educational portfolio that they are doing, and link that into different products or prototypes as well. So it depends on the context in which you are operating as well.
uh, courses like design thinking and first principles are necessary. Yeah, this was.
I think
Yep.
that's more a comment and a really good one. So, absolutely on board. I think, I'm sure many of you in the room would agree that if all of these were integrated into the curricula, and this is where I go back to when you think about entrepreneurial skills or capability being embedded or integrated into the curricula, something needs to go. And this is where the the tension between content and knowledge versus skills and capability and attribute comes into play, and this might be contextually different for different institutional setups.
Yeah, and I would add that
And
it's teaches opportunity discovery, and it also gives opportunity for first principle thinking. It in terms, yeah, I would say it sharpens the first principles thinking, and I would say it's foundational to entrepreneurship, especially in engineering driven programs.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Uh,
Whenever we think about the process, it is a design thinking which kind of gives you that understanding, right? How that works in real world terms. So I have seen that, people have made some comments, and Rude
yeah,
obviously makes a really important point. Yes, sometimes you win, sometimes you learn. But I think the problem
yeah,
is that within the educational setup, we are always, outcome and success oriented when we necessarily do not emphasize on the learning. And learning mostly happens only when you fail, right? And to your point, yes, sometimes you win, sometimes you learn. So that's where I think it needs to be integrated. Failures need to be very intentionally integrated. And Anu Kapoor's book about I hope I got the author right. Productive failure is a really, eye opening in the sense of how to integrate that into the curricula.
yes, thanks. And the next I would see, oh yeah, very nice comments, and I read and I agree to them. And also this SEFI skills position paper, I would encourage all the participants to go through these position papers on different topics that help understand and promote engineering educations. Uh, it, yes,
I just wanted to, if it's okay, Dr. Khan, not take this necessarily as a question, but there's a very important, a very good comment about integrating systems thinking, but in a way that it will be human and user centered. And we have already talked about some elements of that. But coming to Elon's comment about recognizing that entrepreneurial mindset, that it is a metacognitive construct, and there are multiple foundational skills, behaviors, and attitudes or attributes that needs to come together. And I believe that's where the challenge lies, and that's why it's not as easy to integrate that into the curricula as much as we would like it to. And this is where the capacity building versus confidence of staff and the capability of staff themselves is a key element in the success of embedding it.
Yes, and I'm looking at the time. I still have interesting questions and comments, but we have to respect the time, and it's already 4 o'clock. So thank you very much, Dr. Hari, for your inspiring presentation and thoughtful discussion. Uh, and thank you to all participants for your questions, your engagement, your comments, and your time. We hope today's session encourages you to continue exploring entrepreneurial education within your institutions and classrooms. On behalf of the SEFI Entrepreneurship Special Interest Group, I wish you a wonderful day or evening, whatever the time with you is. Thank you, and see you at our next event.
Thank you all very much for being a wonderfully engaged audience, and thank you for all the insights and perspectives. Like I said, thank you for being the change maker that higher education
Yeah.
needs. Please keep up the great work that you're all doing, and I hope that our paths will meet. And I'll, take some of these questions offline as well. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful week and a great 2026 ahead. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you. Bye.